Case 1. Whisper Rayne Hawkbear, Great Falls, Montana, 2025 sentencing. The night was quiet in Great Falls, Montana, when the call came through dispatch. Officers responding to the small Cascade County home expected another domestic disturbance. Maybe a noise complaint. Instead, what they walked into was the kind of scene that haunts even the most seasoned detectives. On the floor, a baby boy just 2 months old lay still, his fragile body showing signs of trauma no infant should ever endure. Beside him, his toddler sister whimpered softly, her tiny frame bruised and battered, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. The silence that followed in that room was deafening. One child was gone forever. The other, scarred and trembling, bore witness to horrors no child should see. For those children, life had only just begun. The infant, barely weeks old, should have been wrapped in warmth and lullabies, cared for with gentle hands. Instead, his tiny cries were met with violence. His sister, only 2 years old, should have been playing with dolls, laughing at cartoons, learning to speak in full sentences. Instead, her earliest memories were filled with pain, memories her young mind may never completely escape. They were robbed not just of safety, but of the innocence every child deserves. Their mother, Whisper Rayne Hawkbear, was a young woman already weighed down by addiction and instability. Relatives later said they would have stepped in if they had known how dire things had become. But the cries inside that home remained hidden until it was too late. Whisper herself admitted during questioning that she lashed out, harming the children who depended on her for everything. It was a shattering confession, not just of guilt, but of the collapse of motherhood itself. When investigators pieced together the timeline, the brutality was undeniable. The baby had endured blunt force injuries that ended his short life. The toddler's injuries told a longer story, one of repeated abuse and neglect, a child surviving in an environment where love was replaced by fear. Family members, blindsided by the news, were left reeling. Some recalled visiting just weeks before, never suspecting what was happening inside. The question echoed through every conversation: how could this have gone unnoticed? The arrest was swift. Whisper was taken into custody and faced detectives who laid the evidence before her. At first there were denials, but as the weight of the truth pressed down, she confessed. The words felt hollow compared to the suffering they described. Yes, she had harmed her newborn son. Yes, she had left her toddler battered and afraid. There was no justification, no explanation that could make sense of it. Only the cold reality that a mother had turned against her children. The courtroom became a place of both justice and sorrow. In 2025, 2 years after the crime, Whisper stood before the court and pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide and endangerment. Testimony from medical experts painted a vivid picture of the baby's final hours, while relatives broke down describing the hole his death had left in their lives. The toddler's survival was described as both a miracle and a tragedy. She lived, but with scars that would last forever. Prosecutors argued that no leniency could be justified, while the defense had little to offer beyond acknowledgement of her guilt. When the judge delivered the sentence, 100 years in prison, the courtroom was heavy with grief. Judge John Parker presided over the sentencing hearing, calling the case truly shocking and tragic. He ordered that no portion of her sentence be suspended, and that she would not be eligible for parole for 30 years. No easy path to redemption. Whisper would spend decades behind bars, likely most of her life. And yet, as family members later said, the sentence, though severe, could never balance the scales. A baby was gone. A little girl's childhood had been broken. No number on paper could restore what had been stolen. In the aftermath, Great Falls was shaken. Community members gathered for vigils, holding candles in the cold night air, whispering prayers for 2 children most had never met but now would never forget. Child welfare advocates spoke out, calling for stronger protections, better interventions, and more resources for struggling parents before tragedy strikes. Teachers, neighbors, and caregivers all asked themselves, would I have noticed? Could I have done something? The surviving daughter was placed into safe hands, taken in by relatives who vowed to surround her with the love and stability she had been denied. For her, the road ahead will not be easy. Healing from trauma that early in life is a long and delicate process. But for those who fight for her future, she represents a chance to turn pain into resilience. And for the baby boy who never saw his first birthday, his memory lives on in the tears of grandparents, the stories of aunts and uncles, and the determination of a community that refuses to let him be forgotten. His short life is a reminder of the fragile line between love and violence, a reminder that vigilance matters, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger lies where it should never exist, in the arms of a parent. The case of Whisper Rayne Hawkbear is more than a crime story. It is a wound carved into the heart of a family and a community. It forces us to confront the darkest truth, that evil does not always come from strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it comes from the very place where a child should feel safest. Home. Case 2. Leannah Jean Gardipe, Missoula, Montana, murders in 2021, sentencing 2023. It was just before dawn in Missoula, Montana on November 19th, 2021, when a frantic 911 call came in. A mother's voice was on the line, but there was no plea for help, only a chilling admission. She told dispatchers that she had killed her 2 young children. Officers rushed to the small home on Missoula's west side, unsure of what they would find. When they arrived, the quiet of the neighborhood was pierced by the sight inside. 2 small children, ages 3 and 5, lying in their beds with deep wounds to their throats. Their blankets were still wrapped around them. They had been murdered in their sleep. The little ones, a boy and a girl, never had the chance to wake up that morning. At 3 and 5 years old, their worlds should have been filled with toys, playgrounds, and the gentle rhythm of bedtime stories. Instead, their lives ended in silence, their final moments stolen by the very person who should have kept them safe. To the first responders, hardened by years of service, it was a scene they would never forget. Officers later admitted that walking into the bedroom felt like stepping into a nightmare, one that no amount of training could prepare them for. The mother was 34-year-old Leannah Jean Gardipe. To neighbors, she was quiet, often keeping to herself, a woman you might nod to while passing by, but never suspect of violence. Behind closed doors, however, she struggled with deep mental health issues and personal turmoil. Investigators later pieced together that in the days before the killings, Gardipe's state of mind had deteriorated. But what no one could explain, what no one could forgive, was how that turmoil turned into a decision to end the lives of 2 innocent children who had no way to defend themselves. When detectives entered the home, Gardipe did not resist. She admitted what she had done, and the weapons were recovered at the scene, and her statements left no room for doubt. The case that followed was less about proving guilt and more about trying to understand why. Family members on both sides of the children's lives were shattered. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, all left to grapple with the unbearable truth that the children they loved so deeply were gone forever, and that their mother was the one responsible. The trial process was long and agonizing. Each hearing forced the family and community to relive the tragedy. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in stark detail, showing how the children had been attacked as they slept, emphasizing that there was no chance for them to cry out or escape. Defense attorneys acknowledged Gardipe's mental health struggles, suggesting they played a role in the killings, but there was little they could say that would soften the horror of her actions. On November 20th, 2023, nearly 2 years after the crime, sentencing took place in Missoula County District Court. Family members filled the courtroom, clutching tissues, photographs, and each other's hands. Some wept openly as the crimes were described again. Others sat in stunned silence, too drained to cry anymore. When the time came, Judge Robert Deschamps addressed the court. His words carried both gravity and sorrow. He acknowledged the pain felt by the surviving relatives and the community, calling the case one of the most tragic he had presided over. Then, with finality, he sentenced Leannah John Gardipe to life in the custody of the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services, ensuring she would never again be free. For many, the sentence brought some measure of relief, but not closure. No punishment could bring back the bright laughter of the little boy or the playful giggles of his sister. Their short lives had been defined by love from grandparents, cousins, and neighbors, and those memories became the only things left to hold on to. In Missoula, the community gathered in vigils, lighting candles, laying flowers, and whispering prayers for 2 children taken far too soon. Advocacy groups used the tragedy to call for better access to mental health treatment, warning that untreated illness can sometimes lead to unthinkable consequences. For the family, the grief remains immeasurable. Birthdays, holidays, and milestones pass in silence, marked only by tears and the empty spaces where 2 children should be. The story of Leannah Jean Gardipe is not just the story of a crime. It is a wound that cuts through an entire community, leaving scars that will never fully heal. And at the center of it are 2 young lives, innocent, beautiful, and irreplaceable, whose absence will forever echo louder than the crime that took them away. Case 3. Sasha Marie Hinds, Sidney, 2019. It was the winter of 2019 in Sidney, a small town in eastern Montana, when chaos broke through the night. The call that came to authorities was frantic and chilling. A newborn was dead, and the scene bore marks of a violent outburst fueled by drugs. When officers arrived, they stepped into a nightmare. A 2-month-old baby girl lay lifeless, her tiny body broken by stab wounds. In the same violent episode, an adult man had been attacked with a knife, his injuries severe but not fatal. The infant had never known the world beyond the safety of her mother's arms, yet it was those very arms that ended her life. At just 2 months old, she should have been wrapped in blankets, soothed to sleep, and growing with the tender rhythms of babyhood. Instead, her cries were met with rage and blades. To the officers who found her, the scene was unbearable, a reminder of how fragile life is and how quickly it can be stolen away. The mother was Sasha Marie Hinds, only 26 years old at the time. Friends and neighbors described her as someone once full of potential, but addiction had carved deep trenches through her life. Methamphetamine had taken hold of her world, distorting her mind and fueling paranoia and anger. In the days leading up to the killing, her behavior had become more erratic, more dangerous, until finally the storm broke inside her own home and her child became the victim. Investigators pieced together what had happened that night. Fueled by meth and paranoia, Hinds turned on those around her. Her daughter, just beginning life, was stabbed to death. A man present in the home was also attacked, left bleeding but alive. The brutality shocked Sidney, a town where violent crime was rare and where everyone seemed to know each other's names. For neighbors, the news spread like wildfire, leaving disbelief and heartbreak in its wake. When Hinds was arrested, she showed little resistance. In interrogation, she admitted to lashing out, but seemed unable to fully explain why. Detectives saw the telltale signs of drug-induced breakdowns, wild swings in mood, incoherent explanations, and a vacant emptiness when confronted with the details of her child's death. For prosecutors, it was clear. Meth had fueled the violence, but choice had driven the knife. In January of 2020, the case reached a pivotal moment. Rather than face a full trial, Sasha Marie Hinds entered a no-contest plea to deliberate homicide and assault with a weapon. The state recommended a sentence of 100 years in prison with 20 suspended, reflecting both the enormity of the crime and the long-term threat she posed. Family members of the baby girl filled the courtroom, their grief spilling over as prosecutors described in detail how the child's life was ended. Some clutched photos of the infant, her cheeks round with the glow of early life, now frozen in memory forever. The judge, whose name was not consistently reported in public coverage, accepted the plea and imposed a sentence that would keep Hinds behind bars for most of her natural life. The decision was met with quiet sobs from the gallery. For the family, there was no relief in seeing her led away in chains. Justice could be measured in years, but love could not be measured at all. A baby was gone, and nothing in the world could ever balance that scale. In Sidney, the shock lingered long after the headlines faded. Residents spoke in hushed tones about the dangers of meth, about how addiction corrodes the soul and leaves devastation in its wake. Community groups doubled down on prevention programs, trying to protect other children from the ripple effects of drugs and violence. Yet for those closest to the baby girl, no program, no sentencing, no law could erase the image of a life lost so early. The story of Sasha Marie Hinds is more than the account of a crime. It is a story of a baby girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her, stolen in a single night of madness. It is a story of addiction, untreated and uncontained, turning love into destruction. And it is a story of a community left with a hole where innocence used to live, forever haunted by the sound of cries that no one will ever hear again. Case 4. Stephanie Grace Byington. Great Falls, 2019. The call that came into Great Falls authorities in February of 2019 was not about strangers or intruders. It was about a 5-year-old boy, Antonio Tony Renova, a little boy with wide brown eyes and a shy smile. He had been found lifeless, his small body covered in bruises, his spirit extinguished by the very people meant to protect him. Tony's short life had been a mix of laughter and quiet resilience. Relatives remembered him as sweet, soft-spoken, and gentle, a child who loved to play, but was often reserved. At just 5 years old, he should have been drawing pictures in kindergarten, riding bikes with friends, and learning to spell his name proudly. Instead, his final days were marked by pain, trapped in a home where abuse had become routine, where fear replaced the safety every child deserves. The one person who should have stood between him and harm was his mother, Stephanie Grace Byington. But instead of protecting Tony, she allowed her boyfriend to beat and torture him. The abuse was relentless: bruises, injuries, neglect. By the time investigators pieced the case together, it was clear that Tony had suffered not only at the hands of a violent man, but also from the silence and complicity of his mother. When officers entered the home in February 2019, the scene was heartbreaking. Tony's small body bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged abuse. Medical examiners later testified that his injuries were consistent with repeated beatings, some healing, others fresh. The evidence was so overwhelming that even hardened detectives described it as one of the worst cases of child abuse they had seen in Cascade County. The investigation quickly turned to Byington and her boyfriend. Interviews revealed that family members had seen warning signs, but hadn't realized how dire the situation had become. Neighbors said they often heard yelling, but never imagined a child was being brutalized inside. As the case unfolded, it became clear Stephanie did not strike the fatal blows, but she allowed them. She watched, did nothing, and in the eyes of the law, that silence was as damning as the abuse itself. In court, Byington pleaded guilty to accountability to deliberate homicide and child endangerment. Prosecutors argued that her failure to act was not negligence, it was complicity. She had chosen her abusive partner over her own child's safety, and Tony paid the price. Family members filled the courtroom, many breaking down as prosecutors showed photos of the little boy whose life had been so violently stolen. Some begged for the harshest sentence possible, saying Tony's voice had been silenced, but his suffering must never be forgotten. On July 26, 2022, the sentence was delivered. Judge Elizabeth Best looked at Byington and called the crime what it was, an unforgivable betrayal of motherhood. She imposed a sentence of 100 years in prison with eligibility for parole only after 30 years. It was a sentence that made clear the state of Montana would not overlook the cost of a mother's silence. For Tony's family, the punishment brought some measure of justice, but not peace. Grandparents, aunts, and cousins continue to carry his memory, the boy who loved to smile, who never got the chance to grow. In Great Falls, his case sparked outrage and heartbreak, a reminder that the most dangerous threats to children sometimes come from within their own homes. Community groups rallied in his name, pushing for stronger child protection systems and encouraging neighbors, teachers, and relatives to speak up when they suspect something is wrong. See something, say something became more than a slogan. It became a plea rooted in the tragedy of a little boy who never got the chance to live his story. The case of Stephanie Grace Byington is not just about crime. It is about Antonio Tony Renova, a 5-year-old whose innocence was betrayed, whose life ended far too soon, and whose name will forever remind Montana of the devastating cost of silence. Case 5, Kayla Jean Edwards, Billings, 2014. It was the summer of 2014 in Billings, Montana, when the call came that would reveal one of the most chilling cases of maternal betrayal in Yellowstone County. 10-week-old twin boys, tiny infants just beginning life, were rushed to the hospital. One would survive with scars, both physical and emotional. The other, little Tavares, would never leave the hospital alive. For family members, the birth of twins had been a moment of joy. 2 boys, identical in their innocence, with the promise of double the laughter, double the milestones, double the love. In the beginning, relatives said, Kayla Jean Edwards seemed like a young mother overwhelmed but proud of her babies. But behind the walls of her home, exhaustion gave way to violence, and frustration hardened into cruelty. On that tragic day, Tavares was found unresponsive. His twin brother, though alive, bore injuries that spoke of abuse and neglect. Doctors quickly determined that this was not an accident, not sudden infant death, but something deliberate. The evidence was undeniable. The fatal injuries were inflicted, and the abuser was the one person the babies trusted most, their mother. Investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together a pattern of abuse. Interviews with relatives revealed missed warning signs, moments when bruises or odd behavior had been explained away. The case shook the Billings community because it wasn't a stranger who harmed the children. It was the woman meant to love them most. Prosecutors charged Kayla Edwards with deliberate homicide for the killing of Tavares and felony assault for the abuse of his surviving twin. The courtroom became the stage for heartbreaking testimony. Doctors described the pain the babies endured. Prosecutors showed the injuries that told the story Tavares could not tell. Family members sobbed as they recalled holding the babies in the hospital, one slipping away while the other clung to life. Every detail was heavy with the reminder that these boys, born together, had lived through very different fates because of their mother's violence. In May of 2016, sentencing day arrived. Edwards, just 24 years old at the time, faced the reality of what she had done. In Yellowstone County District Court, Judge Ingrid Gustafson listened as prosecutors demanded accountability. The defense spoke of Edwards' youth and her struggles, but those arguments paled in comparison to the suffering of the children. Judge Gustafson's words were measured but firm. She acknowledged the gravity of the crime and the life that had been taken. She sentenced Kayla Jean Edwards to 60 years in prison, ensuring that the cost of her actions would follow her for decades. As the sentence was read, family members wept openly, mourning Tavares and praying for the twin who survived. For the surviving brother, life would never be the same. He would grow up without his twin by his side, carrying the invisible scars of a childhood marred by violence. Relatives vowed to give him the love and stability his mother could not provide, determined that he would know protection, not pain. The case of Kayla Jean Edwards left the Billings community shaken. It forced neighbors, teachers, and caregivers to confront the painful truth that sometimes danger comes from the very person children cling to for safety. Tavares's short life became a rallying point for awareness, a call for vigilance, and a reminder that silence in the face of abuse can cost a child everything. In the end, this was not just a story about crime, it was the story of two baby boys, born together, whose paths were split by tragedy. One lost his life before it even truly began. The other will grow up carrying both grief and hope, the grief of what was taken, and the hope that his brother's memory will never fade. Case 6. Amanda Rose. Steffen-Gilbert. Billings, 2012. It was a cold winter morning in Billings, Montana in 2012 when first responders were called to a home where something had gone terribly wrong. Inside, they found a young mother, pale and trembling, and her 3-month-old baby boy, unresponsive. The tiny child, barely old enough to smile or recognize faces, was already gone. The details of his death would soon unravel into one of Yellowstone County's most disturbing and complicated cases. The baby had entered the world just months before, bringing with him the promise of new beginnings. For his family, his arrival had been cause for celebration. Relatives described him as a beautiful, healthy child with a sweet disposition. At 3 months old, he was just beginning to coo, to respond to voices, to grip the fingers of those who held him. His life should have stretched far ahead, filled with laughter, school days, and milestones yet to come. Instead, it ended in silence, his future stolen before it had even begun. The child's mother was Amanda Rose Steffen-Gilbert, then in her mid-20s. Behind closed doors, she had been battling severe mental health struggles. Friends and family noticed her mood swings, her paranoia, and her inability to cope, but few realized just how dangerous the situation had become. On the day of the crime, those struggles escalated into violence. Instead of reaching out for help, Amanda turned on her own baby, smothering him in a moment of delusion and despair. Investigators pieced the timeline together with chilling clarity. The medical examiner confirmed suffocation as the cause of death. There were no signs of outside intrusion, no mystery assailant, only the mother's hand in the death of her infant son. Detectives described Amanda as withdrawn during questioning, alternating between confusion and admission. It was clear this was not a crime of calculation, but one born of mental collapse. Still, the result was the same. A child was gone, forever. For the family, the news was unbearable. Grandparents who had just cradled their grandson weeks before were suddenly planning his funeral. Aunts and uncles who had showered him with gifts were left with unopened packages. The grief was compounded by the reality that the person responsible was not a stranger, but his mother, someone they loved too. In court, prosecutors presented the evidence with quiet firmness. They emphasized the child's innocence, the brutality of his death, and the need for accountability. The defense, meanwhile, leaned heavily on Amanda's mental health struggles, arguing that her illness clouded her judgment and fueled her actions. The courtroom was filled with tension, heartbreak for the baby's lost life, sorrow for the family, and unease about the role mental illness had played. By 2016, after years of hearings and evaluations, the case reached its conclusion. In Yellowstone County District Court, Amanda was found guilty but mentally ill. The verdict meant that while she bore responsibility for her actions, the court recognized her psychiatric condition as a factor. She was sentenced to 40 years at the Montana State Hospital, a sentence meant to keep her confined while addressing her illness. The judge's ruling did little to ease the family's pain. Some wept as the sentence was read, torn between anger and pity. Others stared straight ahead, unable to reconcile love for a daughter with grief for a grandson. What united them was loss, the immeasurable loss of a baby who had barely begun to live. For Billings, the case left a scar. It sparked conversations about postpartum struggles, mental health services, and the gaps in support systems that sometimes allow tragedies to unfold unseen. Child advocates pressed for better screening and intervention for young mothers, while community members gathered at vigils to honor a baby whose life was cut tragically short. The story of Amanda Rose Steffen-Gilbert is not just about a crime. It is about a baby boy who never had the chance to grow, a family shattered by grief, and a community forced to reckon with the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness. His short life remains a haunting reminder that even love, when twisted by illness, can turn into something unrecognizable, and that the most vulnerable among us too often pay the ultimate price. Case 7, Patricia Batts, West Yellowstone, 2020 to 2023. In February of 2020, the quiet resort town of West Yellowstone, Montana, became the scene of one of the most harrowing child abuse cases the state had ever witnessed. 12-year-old James Alex Hurley was found dead inside his grandparents' home. What at first seemed like a tragedy of natural causes soon revealed itself to be something far darker, a prolonged campaign of torture and abuse, orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to protect him. Alex was remembered by classmates and relatives as a curious, bright boy who loved to joke and had a mischievous smile that could light up a room. He had recently moved to Montana to live with his grandparents, hoping for stability and safety. Instead, what awaited him was cruelty. In the weeks leading up to his death, neighbors heard shouting, and investigators would later uncover chilling cell phone videos, footage showing Alex being beaten, mocked, and humiliated by his own family. At the center of it all was Patricia Batts, Alex's grandmother, who had assumed the role of caretaker. Instead of nurturing, she fostered an environment of violence and control. Prosecutors described her as the ringleader in a household where abuse became routine. She encouraged and participated in the torment, allowing her husband, son, and others in the home to inflict pain on Alex day after day. By the time of his death, Alex's body bore the marks of systematic torture, bruises, wounds, and evidence of starvation and neglect. The investigation shocked even veteran law enforcement officers. Detectives uncovered hours of disturbing video evidence, documenting not just moments of rage, but a pattern of deliberate cruelty. Alex was struck with wooden objects, forced to endure beatings, and deprived of care. Prosecutors said the abuse was designed to break him down physically and emotionally. What was uncovered in that West Yellowstone home was nothing short of a house of horrors. When Patricia Batts was arrested, she showed little remorse. At first, she tried to shift blame, pointing to others in the household. But as the evidence mounted, the videos, the medical examiner's findings, the testimony of witnesses, it became impossible to deny her central role. She was charged with deliberate homicide, child endangerment, and witness tampering. The courtroom proceedings were some of the most emotionally charged Gallatin County had ever seen. Family members of Alex, including those who had not been in the home, wept openly as prosecutors described the boy's final days. The videos were shown in court, and their contents were so disturbing that some spectators had to leave the room. Prosecutors argued that Batts had created a culture of abuse, orchestrating the violence as though it were a grim routine. The defense, with little ground to stand on, pointed to Batts' declining health and argued for leniency, but their words rang hollow in the face of the suffering Alex endured. On August 23, 2023, in Gallatin County District Court, Judge John Brown handed down the sentence. His words were deliberate, his tone heavy with the gravity of the crime. He sentenced Patricia Batts to life in prison, ensuring she would never walk free again. For many, it was the only sentence that could reflect the enormity of the crime Yet even as the decision was read, Alex's family wept, knowing no verdict could bring him back. The aftermath of the case left Montana reeling. News of Alex's torture and death spread far beyond West Yellowstone, sparking outrage across the state and beyond. Lawmakers and child advocates pointed to the case as a wake-up call, demanding stronger protections for children, especially those placed with extended family under guardianship. The haunting cell phone videos became a rallying cry, a reminder that signs of abuse must never be ignored. Today, Alex is remembered not for the way his life ended, but for the boy he was, playful, kind, and full of potential. Vigils were held in his honor, candles lit against the Montana night sky to remind the world that his life mattered. For his relatives who truly loved him, the grief remains raw, but so does the determination to ensure his story is not forgotten. The case of Patricia Batts is one of the darkest chapters in Montana's criminal history. It is a story of a boy betrayed by those he trusted most, of a community forced to confront unimaginable cruelty, and of a justice system tasked with speaking for a child who no longer could. Alex's story will forever stand as a haunting reminder that vigilance and compassion are not optional when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable among us. Case 8. Ashley Marie Howard, Glendive, 2018. Toddler, hot car death. The town of Glendive, Montana, woke to devastating news in the summer of 2018. A 2-year-old boy named Caleb Hopkins was dead, and the circumstances were as preventable as they were heartbreaking. He hadn't died of illness or accident. He had died alone, strapped in the backseat of a car that became an oven, while his mother slept off a night of drinking and partying. Caleb was just beginning to discover the world around him. Bright, curious eyes taking in everything, clumsy steps that made his family laugh, and a giggle that could light up a room. At 2 years old, he should have been chasing butterflies, learning new words, and begging for just one more bedtime story. Instead, his final hours were spent in silence and unbearable heat, struggling to breathe as the temperature inside the car rose past safe limits. By the time his little body was discovered, it was too late. His short life was over, stolen not by strangers or violence, but by neglect. His mother, Ashley Marie Howard, was only 19 at the time of Caleb's death. Friends said she had been drifting between jobs, living without much structure, and spending nights at parties. On that fatal night, she drove to a gathering, left Caleb asleep in the car, and went inside to drink and socialize. When she finally drove home in the early morning hours, she parked, left him inside, and collapsed into bed. Oversleeping the next day sealed her child's fate. When she finally returned to the car and opened the door, she was met with silence. Caleb was gone. Investigators quickly pieced the story together. There was no accident, no mechanical failure. Caleb had been left unattended for hours with no one to check on him while his mother slept. By the time officers measured the interior of the car, the temperatures had soared beyond survivable levels. Prosecutors said the evidence was clear. Caleb's death was not just tragic, it was the direct result of reckless choices. The case cut deep into Dawson County. Neighbors and strangers alike filled social media with outrage and sorrow. How could a toddler's life end so cruelly, so needlessly? For many, it was unthinkable that a mother would choose alcohol and sleep over the basic responsibility of checking on her child. Vigils were held in Caleb's memory, where community members lit candles and prayed that his short life would not be forgotten. When Ashley was charged with negligent homicide, the courtroom became a place of raw grief. Caleb's relatives sat through testimony about how hot the car had become, how his small body would have reacted to the rising heat, and how preventable it all was. Grandparents sobbed quietly as prosecutors showed photos of the little boy with a wide smile, reminding the court of the life that had been erased. Family members spoke of toys left behind in silence, birthdays that would never come, and a future lost before it began. The defense pointed to Ashley's youth, immaturity, and her struggles with alcohol. They argued she hadn't intended to harm her son, that she was simply overwhelmed and careless, but those arguments could not erase the image of Caleb's last hours. The prosecution reminded the jury and judge that intent was not needed here. Negligence had been more than enough to kill. On October 9, 2020, in Dawson County District Court, Judge Olivia Rieger delivered her sentence. She told the courtroom that Caleb's death was preventable, that a parent's duty to their child is sacred and cannot be excused by immaturity or recklessness. She sentenced Ashley Howard to 20 years in prison, with 5 years suspended, meaning 15 years to serve before release. It was a punishment meant not only for accountability, but also to send a message about the importance of vigilance in caring for children. For Caleb's family, no number of years could bring back what was lost. Grandparents later spoke about how their arms ached for the child they would never hold again. His cousins would grow up without him, his milestones frozen at just 2 years old. For them, justice was not measured in years behind bars, but in the gaping hole left in their lives. In the aftermath, Caleb's story became a rallying point. Across Montana, child advocates and safety groups began pushing harder for awareness around hot car deaths, running campaigns to remind parents to look before you lock. Posters, PSAS, and educational drives tried to hammer home the warning. But for Caleb Hopkins, those lessons had come too late. His story instead became the cautionary tale others hoped would save future lives. Today, Caleb is remembered not for the way he died, but for the joy he brought in his 2 short years. His smile lives on in photographs cherished by his family. His name is spoken at vigils and whispered in prayers, and his memory is honored each time his story reminds another parent, another caregiver, to check the back seat, to never leave a child behind, and to never take for granted the precious life of a little one. Case 9, Audria, Shannon Nickerson, Butte, 2019, infant smothering while high on meth. It was a cold winter day in Butte, Montana, in 2019 when tragedy unfolded inside a parked car. 27-year-old Audria Shannon Nickerson had pulled over after a long night of using methamphetamine. Her 5-month-old baby boy was in the back seat, bundled against the chill. But as exhaustion and drugs clouded her mind, she fell asleep, drifting into a heavy stupor. Hours later, when she awoke, the child was unresponsive. What should have been a routine outing turned into an unthinkable nightmare. Her infant son had been smothered to death while she was passed out. The baby boy's life had barely begun. At 5 months old, he was just discovering his voice, just beginning to smile with recognition when his mother's face appeared above him. He was at that magical stage of infancy where every day brought something new, rolling over, babbling, clutching at toys. Relatives described him as a happy, beautiful child, adored by those around him. He should have had a lifetime of love and milestones ahead. Instead, his life ended before it could truly begin. His final breaths taken in silence as his mother slept in a haze of addiction. When first responders arrived, they tried desperately to revive him, but it was too late. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was suffocation, made more likely by the unsafe conditions inside the car. For investigators, the story that unfolded was painfully clear. This was not an accident of fate, but a tragedy of neglect, fueled by drugs that stole a mother's ability to care for her child. The arrest came swiftly. Nickerson admitted to police that she had been using meth and had fallen asleep, never realizing the danger she had placed her baby in. Detectives described her as distraught but resigned, acknowledging her role even as she struggled to explain why she had chosen drugs over responsibility. For the community of Butte, the case struck a nerve. Addiction was a problem many families knew too well, but the idea of an infant paying the ultimate price brought that struggle into sharp and painful focus. In court, the proceedings were heart-wrenching. Prosecutors emphasized the baby's innocence, painting a vivid picture of a child whose life had been cut short because of his mother's choices. They charged her with negligent homicide, arguing that her drug use and decisions directly caused her son's death. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, highlighted her history of addiction and argued for rehabilitation, saying Nickerson was not a monster, but a young woman destroyed by meth. On June 21, 2021, in Silver Bow County District Court, Judge Kurt Kruger delivered the sentence. He spoke plainly, reminding the courtroom that a helpless baby had lost his life because the one person responsible for protecting him had failed. Nickerson was sentenced to 20 years with the Department of Corrections, with 6 years suspended, effectively 14 years to serve. Judge Kruger noted that while addiction is a disease, it does not absolve responsibility, especially when a child's life is at stake. For the family, the sentence was met with tears and grief. Some relatives wept openly while others stared down at their hands, lost in sorrow. They would never see the baby grow into a toddler, never hear his first words, never watch him take his first steps. Their grief was immeasurable, a permanent wound carved into the heart of a family. In Butte, the case sparked broader conversations about the impact of meth on families. Advocates pointed to the tragedy as a reminder that addiction doesn't just destroy the user, it tears apart entire households, leaving the most vulnerable children in harm's way. Efforts to expand treatment programs for struggling parents gained momentum, but for one baby boy, the change came too late. The story of Audria Shannon Nickerson is not only the story of a crime, it is the story of a 5-month-old boy whose short life ended before it began, of a family mourning a child who will never grow up, and of a community forced to face the devastating cost of addiction. His memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved him, a small life forever cherished and forever missed. Case 10, Takara Kaye Juntunen, Kalispell, 2015, failure to protect her 2-year-old son, Forrest Groeschel. In Kalispell, Montana, the death of 2-year-old Forrest Groeschel in 2015 sent shockwaves through the Flathead Valley. Forrest was a bright, wide-eyed toddler with a mop of brown hair and the curiosity only a 2-year-old can carry. Relatives described him as playful and affectionate, a child who loved to giggle and climb, who was just beginning to put words together and explore the world around him. But instead of safety and love, Forrest's short life was marked by terror, ending in the most brutal way possible. Forrest was living with his mother, Takara Kaye Juntunen, and her boyfriend. Behind closed doors, the household was a storm of violence and neglect. The boyfriend regularly beat Forrest, and the abuse was obvious. Bruises on his small body, injuries no child should have. Neighbors later recalled hearing disturbing sounds from the home, but the abuse continued, hidden in plain sight, and through it all, Takara did nothing to protect her son. Instead, she allowed the violence to escalate, until one night the beatings ended Forrest's life. When investigators arrived, the little boy's body told a story of prolonged abuse. The coroner's report was graphic, listing broken bones, deep bruises, and internal injuries consistent with repeated violence. Detectives said it was one of the most horrifying child abuse cases they had seen in Flathead County. What made it even more devastating was that his mother had stood by and allowed it to happen. Her silence, her failure to act, had been as deadly as the blows themselves. The community was outraged. How could a mother, the one person meant to nurture and protect, stand by as her child was brutalized? For Forrest's extended family, the grief was unbearable. Grandparents spoke of a little boy who had brought joy into their lives, only to be ripped away by neglect and betrayal. His death became not just a family tragedy, but a wound carried by an entire town. In 2016, Takara Juntunen was brought before the court. She faced charges of negligent homicide for failing to protect Forrest, as well as accountability for the abuse he endured. In court, prosecutors emphasized the severity of her inaction, arguing that she had chosen to protect her relationship with her violent boyfriend instead of safeguarding her child. They described Forrest's final hours in painful detail, reminding the jury and the judge that he was defenseless, completely dependent on his mother, and utterly failed. On December 21, 2016, in Flathead County District Court, Judge Heidi Ulbricht delivered the sentence. She condemned Juntunen's choices and acknowledged the unimaginable suffering Forrest endured. Juntunen was sentenced to 20 years with the Department of Corrections, with 15 years suspended. The sentence meant she would serve 5 years behind bars, a decision that outraged many who felt justice for Forrest demanded far more. Family members wept openly in the courtroom, some shaking their heads in disbelief. For them, no sentence could balance the scales. A 2-year-old boy was dead, his potential erased, his laughter silenced forever. For the community, the case left a bitter taste, a sense that Forrest had been failed not only by his mother, but by the system meant to protect him. In Kalispell, Forrest's death became a rallying cry. Child advocates pushed for stronger intervention laws, for neighbors and relatives to speak out louder when they suspect abuse, and for authorities to respond faster. The case served as a reminder that silence can be just as dangerous as violence, and that children like Forrest are often caught in the middle, voiceless and vulnerable. Forrest Groshelle is remembered not for the way his life ended, but for the joy he brought in his 2 short years. His family cherishes the photographs of him smiling, the sound of his giggle echoing in memory. Though his life was brief, his story endures as a warning, a lesson, and above all, a reminder of the fragile sacred duty of protecting the innocent. Case 11, Misty Marie Cutburth, Great Falls, 2016, infant death. From exposure neglect, the city of Great Falls, Montana was left shaken in 2016 by the tragic death of an infant girl whose life had barely begun. The case wasn't one of sudden violence or deliberate homicide, but of neglect so profound that it became fatal. The mother, Misty Marie Cutburth, was supposed to be her daughter's protector. Instead, her actions and her inactions left the baby exposed, vulnerable, and ultimately gone. The little girl was only months old, an age when every cry is a call for comfort and every need depends entirely on the love of a caregiver. Relatives described her as a sweet, quiet baby with bright eyes and a soft laugh that melted hearts. In those early months of life, her future stretched wide open. First words, first steps, birthdays, and milestones waiting ahead. But all of that was stolen when neglect replaced care, and indifference replaced protection. Investigators pieced together the chain of events. Misty, struggling with substance abuse and instability, left her infant daughter in conditions no child should have to endure. The baby was exposed to the elements and left without the basic necessities of survival. When she was finally found, she was already gone. The image of that lifeless infant haunted the officers, medics, and neighbors who witnessed the aftermath. They knew this was not an unavoidable accident. It was a death that could have been prevented. The case struck a raw nerve in Cascade County. Parents and grandparents in the community mourned a child most of them never knew, imagining their own babies and grandchildren in her place. Local advocates called it a devastating example of how addiction and neglect can destroy the lives of the most vulnerable. For many, the pain was sharpened by the realization that the little girl had no voice, no chance to ask for help, and the one person who should have been her advocate had failed her entirely. When Misty Cutburth was charged, she eventually entered a no-contest plea to criminal endangerment. In court, prosecutors detailed the baby's suffering, emphasizing that her death was the direct result of choices her mother had made. Defense attorneys acknowledged Misty's struggles but asked the court for leniency, citing her addiction and difficult circumstances. Family members of the infant listened in silence, some in tears, as the story of the baby's final days was retold in stark detail. On August 9, 2018, in Cascade County District Court, Judge Greg Pinsky delivered the sentence. He told Misty that her daughter's death was an avoidable tragedy, one that demanded accountability. He sentenced her to 10 years with the Department of Corrections, all suspended on the condition that she successfully complete drug court and treatment programs. For some, it was a second chance, but for others, it felt painfully inadequate. In the gallery, family members wept. Some felt relief that Misty would get the help she desperately needed. Others were overcome by anger, believing that justice for the baby required more than a suspended sentence. Regardless of opinion, the truth remained. A little girl's life was gone, and nothing could undo that loss. For the community of Great Falls, the case became a somber lesson. Advocates called for stronger intervention programs for struggling parents and more resources for addiction treatment before children are placed in harm's way. The baby's death underscored how quickly neglect can turn fatal and how the most fragile lives can slip through the cracks when society looks away. Though she never had the chance to grow, the memory of Misty Cutburth's daughter endures. She is remembered in photographs and whispered prayers at night, and in the aching hearts of those who wished they could have saved her. Her story is a reminder that protecting children is not optional, and that silence in the face of neglect can be just as deadly as violence. Case 12. Pamela Jean Courtnage, Great Falls 2017 to 2021. It was November 2017 in Great Falls, Montana, when a quiet home became the scene of a crime that stunned both family and community. Inside, 69-year-old Catherine Courtnage was found dead, not from accident or natural causes, but from an assault that ended her life. What investigators uncovered next sent shockwaves through Cascade County. Catherine's killer was her own daughter, Pamela Jean Courtnage. For those who knew Catherine, the news was almost impossible to process. She was remembered as a gentle, generous woman who loved her family deeply. Neighbors described her as warm and approachable, the kind of person who would wave from her porch or lend a hand without hesitation. Her later years should have been filled with peace, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Instead, her life was taken violently by the very person she had spent her life caring for. Pamela, then in her mid-40s, had battled mental illness for years. Court documents and testimony later revealed a long history of psychiatric struggles, paranoia, delusions, and erratic behavior that strained her relationship with her family. Still, Catherine never gave up on her daughter. She supported her, housed her, and tried to give her stability. To friends, Catherine's loyalty was unwavering. To investigators, that loyalty may have cost her life. The night of the crime was marked by confusion and chaos. Pamela, in the grip of a mental health crisis, lashed out at her mother. The attack left Catherine fatally injured. When police arrived, they saw no forced entry, no signs of burglary or intrusion. The evidence pointed inward, to Pamela. Detectives later said the hardest part of their job that night was knowing they would have to tell a grieving family that their loved one had been murdered by her own daughter. For Catherine's relatives, the loss was twofold. They had lost a beloved mother and grandmother in the most violent way imaginable. And they had lost Pamela too, to a mind that had spiraled beyond control. In interviews, some family members expressed heartbreak that Catherine's compassion and willingness to help her daughter had placed her directly in harm's way. Others wrestled with guilt, asking themselves if there was more they could have done to intervene before tragedy struck. The case moved slowly through the courts, delayed by repeated psychiatric evaluations. Prosecutors charged Pamela with mitigated deliberate homicide, a recognition that while her mental illness did not absolve her of responsibility, it did weigh heavily in the circumstances. The defense leaned on this fact, painting a picture of a woman consumed by illness, not malice. By 2021, after 4 years of legal proceedings, Pamela stood in Cascade County District Court before Judge Elizabeth Best. She pleaded guilty. The courtroom was filled with family members, some holding photographs of Catherine, others sitting silently, bracing themselves for the final outcome. Prosecutors spoke about Catherine's life and the brutality of her death, reminding the court that she had been robbed of her final years of peace. The defense acknowledged the tragedy, but asked the judge to consider Pamela's long-standing mental illness and need for treatment. Judge Best delivered a sentence that reflected both accountability and compassion. Pamela Jean Courtnage was sentenced to 40 years under the custody of the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services to be served at Montana State Hospital. Judge Best explained that the sentence ensured Pamela would remain confined, receiving psychiatric treatment while also acknowledging the irreversible harm she had caused. The family's reactions were raw and divided. Some wept, torn between grief and anger. Others quietly expressed hope that Pamela would finally get the help she needed. But the one sentiment shared by all was loss. They had lost Catherine forever, and in many ways they had lost Pamela years earlier when mental illness began to consume her. In Great Falls, the community grieved alongside the family. Vigils were held for Catherine, and her friends described her as a woman whose kindness deserved a gentler ending. Advocates pointed to the case as a reminder of the urgent need for stronger mental health resources in Montana. They warned that untreated crises could lead to devastation and that silence around mental illness often carries dangerous consequences. Catherine Courtnage is remembered today not for the violence of her final moments, but for the life she lived, a life of compassion, devotion to family, and generosity of spirit. Her death remains one of the most haunting reminders in Montana's recent history that danger can come not from strangers, but from within a family torn apart by illness and unspoken pain. The story of Pamela Jean Courtnage is both a crime story and a cautionary tale about the fragility of family bonds, the devastating cost of untreated mental illness, and the urgent need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. These are Montana's darkest stories, mothers who betrayed the children they were meant to protect, and in one case, a daughter who was also a mother, taking the life of her own mother. The pain runs through generations, leaving families broken forever. By remembering these victims, we keep their stories alive and remind ourselves of the fragile line between love and destruction. If this video moved you, please subscribe to Unforeseen Fates so more voices of victims can be heard. Like this video if you believe their stories matter, and comment your thoughts below.